Welcome back to With the Browns. In the rugged heart of Flagstaff, Arizona, lies a property that has become as infamous as the family that bought it. Coyote Pass. Hundreds of acres of untamed land where pine trees stretch skyward like watchmen, and the sun spills molten gold across rolling hills at dusk. At first glance, it looks like heaven. A sanctuary. The kind of place where generations could grow together, where peace could finally be found. But that beauty is deceptive. Because beneath the soil of Coyote Pass, beneath the pine needles and the dust, lies a story of broken promises, financial betrayal, and a family tearing itself apart under the watchful eyes of millions. For Cody Brown, Coyote Pass was never just land. It was his crown jewel, the evidence that his vision of plural marriage could not only survive, but thrive. He spoke of it with the conviction of a preacher. He imagined 4 homes built side by side. He saw his wives, his children, his grandchildren, all united on one piece of sacred soil. He called it a family compound, a fortress of unity against the world that judged them. To outsiders, to viewers of Sister Wives, it sounded like a bold dream. Something larger than life, something noble. But dreams have a way of collapsing when they are built on shaky foundations. Because while Cody dreamed, his wives carried the burden. Mary, often pushed aside and overlooked, still poured her emotional energy and financial resources into the land. She wanted a home that reflected her, a place where she could finally carve out stability after years of sacrifices. Janelle, the pragmatic builder, spent countless hours drawing sketches, crunching numbers, and walking the property, her hope tied to each pine tree and open field. Christine, with her free-spirited soul, wanted nothing more than space for her children to laugh, to grow, to escape the suffocating rules of Cody's control. And then there was Robyn, the newest wife, whose role on the land was always complicated, entangled not just in the vision of Coyote Pass, but in the politics of who would gain and who would lose. But visions and reality rarely walk the same path. What started as small disagreements, about whose house would go where, about which wife contributed what, soon spiraled into something deeper. Money became a weapon. Resentments grew like weeds. Each wife had invested, one with cash, another with labor, another with dreams. Yet Cody stood in the center, proclaiming himself manager and leader, while dismissing the sacrifices that didn't fit his narrative. The cameras showed maps, blueprints, and hopeful discussions. But behind those staged smiles, the truth was uglier. Meetings ended in shouting matches. Promises turned into ultimatums. What was supposed to unify them was, in reality, driving them further apart. The land itself became a battlefield. Christine began to pull away, exhausted by the endless compromises that seemed to benefit only Cody and Robyn. Janelle, once loyal to Cody's leadership, started demanding clarity, proof that her financial contributions would not vanish into thin air. Mary grew bitter, her once loyal heart breaking as she realized her sacrifices might never be recognized. And Robyn? Her closeness to Cody made her the target of suspicion. Whispers spread that she was the true beneficiary of Coyote Pass, while the others were simply pawns in a game they could never win. And then came the crushing weight of public scrutiny. The Sister Wives cameras captured fragments of their struggle, but the real war raged off-screen. Every rumor, every half-truth, every whispered fight was amplified by fans and critics alike. On Reddit, in tabloids, on television, viewers dissected every move. And the more the world watched, the harder it became for the Browns to hide their fractures. What might have been solved in private for another family turned into a national spectacle. Each wife's pain became a storyline. Each betrayal became a headline. As time passed, the dream of Coyote Pass shifted from unity to survival. Each wife began protecting her own interests, her own children, her own future. Meetings that were supposed to solve problems became war councils. Decisions about fences, wells, and boundaries devolved into accusations of greed and favoritism. And looming over it all was the one unspoken truth. There was no legal clarity. No contracts. No division of land on paper. Just promises, handshakes, and Cody's word. And when money and family collide without structure, disaster is inevitable. The breaking point was not just emotional, it was financial. Cody had tied up vast amounts of money into the property, expecting loyalty and blind faith in return. But the wives, each having contributed in different ways, began demanding recognition. Recognition of the cash Janelle poured in. Recognition of the emotional labor Christine had endured. Recognition of the decades Mary had sacrificed. But instead of unity, the lack of clear agreements turned the soil of Coyote Pass toxic. Each decision became a spark for another fire. Each compromise felt like surrender. And soon, the whispers of lawyers and legal documents grew louder. What began as a dream was now destined to end in court. So here we are. Coyote Pass still stands. The pines still stretch tall. The sunsets still paint the sky with crimson fire. But to the Browns, that land is no longer just a property. It is a silent witness. A stage where their marriage, their faith, and their empire crumbled. And as the courtroom doors swing open, the question echoes louder than ever. Will Coyote Pass be remembered as the land that united the Browns, or the very ground that tore them apart forever? Forever. Every decision made beneath the towering shadows of Coyote Pass began to feel less like a family discussion and more like a game of high-stakes chess, where every move threatened to alter the balance forever. What was once a dream of unity had morphed into a crucible, a place where ambition clashed with betrayal, and where the air itself felt heavy with unspoken resentments. The land, meant to be their sanctuary, was now a battlefield, where every tree seemed to whisper secrets, and every gust of wind carried the weight of looming conflict. At first, the disputes were hidden, small arguments about boundaries, finances, or whose voice carried more weight. But over time, those private clashes spilled into the open, their quiet rumblings transforming into something louder, sharper, impossible to contain. By the time the first steps toward legal action were taken, it was already clear. The Brown story was no longer just a family squabble. It was a saga, a tale of ambition, of broken promises, and of dreams turned to ash. And like wildfire in a dry forest, it was destined to capture the attention of an audience far beyond Flagstaff. For Mary and Janelle, the breaking point had been a long time coming. Once faithful contributors to the dream, they now found themselves silenced, sidelined, treated as if their voices were background noise in Cody's grand performance. Meetings about land allocations ended in frustration. Conversations about financial fairness dissolved into arguments where their words seemed to vanish before they ever reached his ears. Years of patience, of compromise, of emotional and financial investment, gone, replaced with bitterness and betrayal. And so their decision was not impulsive. It was not reckless. It was deliberate, born of countless sleepless nights and unanswered questions. They turned to attorneys. They gathered documents. They revisited years of texts, emails, and bank records. Quietly, carefully, they prepared for war. Their claim was simple yet devastating. We invested in this land. We worked for this land. We sacrificed for this land. And we deserve to be recognized. To Mary and Janelle, this was not just about acreage or property lines. It was about dignity. It was about being seen after decades of being ignored. Cody, on the other hand, viewed their lawsuit as treason. In his mind, he had financed Coyote Pass, he had carried the vision, and he alone had the authority. To challenge him was to question the very empire he believed he had built. But even as he gathered his defense, the cracks in his certainty showed. Because this was never just about money. It was about betrayal, about wives who had walked away, about the empire he no longer controlled. And then there was Robyn. Always close to Cody, always protected by him, her role in the courtroom was inevitable. Though she had not filed a claim, her testimony would carry weight. Her loyalty was a sword, but it was also a liability. For every word she spoke in defense of Cody, another detail slipped, small inconsistencies that bolstered Mary and Janelle's case. She spoke candidly, but candid truth often cuts both ways. And in those moments, Robyn's words became daggers, not just to Cody's defense, but to the fragile illusion of unity that remained. The legal storm gained speed with frightening momentum. Attorneys dissected every piece of evidence: informal agreements, verbal promises, emotional sacrifices. Mary's team highlighted her financial contributions, her emotional labor, her years of overlooked dedication. Janelle's attorneys painted a vivid picture of her walking the land, drawing maps, planning homes, her sweat and vision woven into every inch of Coyote Pass. They argued that while the paperwork may have been thin, the intent and actions of these women made their ownership undeniable. Cody's defense countered with cold technicalities. The property deeds bore his name, the larger sums of money had come from him, and without formal agreements, the wives had no legal standing. But what Kody's lawyers could not control were the emotions flooding into every corner of the courtroom. By the time the trial loomed, the stakes were clear. This was no longer just a legal matter. It was history. It was family. It was personal. The Browns weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for their legacies. Social media erupted like wildfire. Hashtags trended overnight. Justice for Janelle, Stand with Mary, Coyote Pass battle. Fans debated endlessly on Reddit, in Facebook groups, on YouTube reaction channels. Some called Kody a tyrant, clinging to control. Others saw Mary and Janelle as rebels, brave enough to finally break the silence. This wasn't just a case. It was a cultural conversation about fairness, about polygamy, about the cost of blind loyalty. And yet, while the world argued, Coyote Pass itself grew eerily quiet. The pine trees stood tall, but their shadows seemed darker. The rolling hills, once painted as the Browns' future paradise, now felt haunted by broken promises. The land became a silent witness, holding in its soil the anger, the resentment, the betrayal of a family torn apart. When the courtroom doors finally swung open, anticipation hung in the air like static before a storm. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens scratching furiously across notebooks. Cameras clicked. Every whisper seemed amplified, every breath heavy with expectation. Mary and Janelle sat side by side, their faces masks of determination, though the strain in their eyes betrayed months of preparation. In front of them lay photographs, receipts, and documents, proof of years of sacrifice. Kody sat across from them, his face rigid, his jaw clenched. Robyn leaned close to him, whispering support, though her own unease was evident in the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. The judge entered. Silence fell like a curtain. Judge Elena Ramirez, known for her sharp intellect and iron steadiness, took her seat. Her gaze swept the room, pausing for a fraction of a second on each Brown family member, as if silently acknowledging the gravity of what was about to unfold. The gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. The battle for Coyote Pass had officially begun. Mary's attorney rose first. With practiced calm, they laid out the history, photos of family gatherings on the land, bank transfers showing Mary's financial contributions, texts where she had begged for inclusion in decisions. The evidence told a story not of a silent wife, but of an active participant systematically erased from recognition. Janelle's team followed, presenting emails, sketches, even notes from family meetings where her suggestions were ignored or dismissed. Each piece of evidence piled onto the last, building a case that felt less like numbers on a page and more like decades of silenced voices finally demanding to be heard. Kody's defense pushed back, but every argument seemed to land with less weight. His lawyers emphasized ownership, financial hierarchy, and the absence of contracts. But as Robyn took the stand, their strategy began to unravel. Her words, intended to protect Kody, revealed contradictions. She recalled land division discussions that didn't match Kody's story. She admitted to conversations where Mary and Janelle had been left out. With each answer, the defense faltered, and the plaintiffs grew stronger. The courtroom became electric. Cross-examinations grew heated. Witnesses clashed. Lawyers snapped objections. Emotions spilled over as years of hidden resentments resurfaced in sharp exchanges. By the end of the first day, the courtroom was no longer just a legal arena. It was a theater of human struggle, where ambition, betrayal, and the longing for justice collided under the harsh glare of truth. And in that theater, one question remained suspended in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Would Coyote Pass finally give the women recognition, or would it bury them once again beneath Kody's vision of control? The walls of the Flagstaff courthouse seemed to hum with tension, as if the very foundation of the building understood the weight of history unfolding within. The story of Coyote Pass, once painted by Kody Brown as a dream of unity, prosperity, and eternal family harmony, had now twisted into something darker, a legal crucible where loyalty, betrayal, and truth collided head-on. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation, every whispered conversation bouncing off polished oak benches, every pen scratch echoing louder than it should. This wasn't just about property lines or acreage. This was about years of sacrifice, about women whose labor, money, and hearts had been poured into a vision that, for too long, had gone unacknowledged. Every testimony carried the sting of disappointment. Every document introduced carried the weight of promises broken. For Judge Elena Ramirez, presiding with the calm neutrality of experience, it wasn't just another property dispute. It was the unmasking of a family empire that had lived half in the spotlight, half in shadows. As the gavel cracked, signaling the close of a morning filled with motions and counter-motions, the energy in the courtroom shifted. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras clicked, and fans watching live updates online could almost feel that the next moment would alter everything. And then it happened. Robyn Brown, the last wife standing at Cody's side, was called back to the stand. Her heels clicked softly across the floor, but to Mary and Janelle, the sound might as well have been a drum roll announcing destiny. Robyn had entered the courtroom to defend Cody, to protect the fragile foundation of their so-called family vision. At first, her words flowed easily. Details about meetings, about parcels of land, about verbal promises exchanged around kitchen tables. On the surface, it sounded routine, almost boring. But beneath the surface, her testimony carried cracks that no defense attorney could patch. When pressed by Mary and Janelle's lawyers, Robyn admitted that much of the family's planning had been nothing more than casual conversations. Handshakes, nods, unrecorded promises. No contracts, no signatures, no safeguards. Just words, tossed into the air like confetti and expected to stick. As she spoke, her tone wavered between defense and confession. What she meant to shield Cody with instead began to unravel him. Every "we thought," or Cody said, only reinforced the plaintiff's argument that there had been no transparency, no fairness, no recognition of what Mary and Janelle had poured into Coyote Pass. The shift in the room was almost physical. Mary's jaw unclenched. Janelle's shoulders dropped, just slightly, as if years of being silenced were lifting, ounce by ounce. Their attorneys pounced, pressing harder. Who made the decisions? Were the wives consulted? Were financial contributions ever logged? Robyn answered honestly, too honestly. The words landed like blows, each one confirming what Mary and Janelle had shouted into the void for years. Even Cody's team felt the pressure. His lawyer leaned forward, fidgeting with notes, scrambling for ways to reframe Robyn's admissions. Cody himself sat rigid, jaw tight, his usual confidence hollowing into visible unease. For the first time, his empire wasn't just cracking in private living rooms or reality TV confessionals. It was crumbling under oath, in the cold light of a courtroom. Judge Ramirez, ever stoic, did not reveal her thoughts. But the intensity with which she wrote, the deliberate way she underlined certain lines of Robyn's testimony, told its own story. She saw what everyone else did. This was a turning point. Not with theatrics, not with screaming or outbursts, but with clarity. Clarity that exposed the defense's foundation as sand instead of stone. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was instantaneous. Clips of Robyn's testimony hit social media within minutes. Hashtags exploded. Robyn cracks, Coyote Pass lies, justice for Janelle and Mary began trending. Fans debated fiercely. Some stunned that Robyn had admitted so much, others claiming she had simply spoken the truth. Commentators compared the case to famous family feuds, calling it the unraveling of polygamy's most famous dynasty. Inside, however, the atmosphere was electric and suffocating all at once. Cody avoided Robyn's gaze. Robyn, visibly shaken, avoided everyone's. Mary and Janelle, though far from celebrating, allowed themselves small breaths of relief. For years, they had been footnotes in Cody's grand narrative. Now the courtroom had forced the world to see them as architects, as investors, as rightful owners whose voices had been smothered. By day's end, as lawyers packed up binders and reporters raced to file stories, it was clear the momentum had shifted. Robyn's testimony, subtle, raw, and unintentionally damning, had tilted the scales. For Cody, it was the nightmare scenario. For Mary and Janelle, it was vindication at last. And as dusk fell over Flagstaff, the pines of Coyote Pass stood tall and silent, their shadows stretching across land that had become more than dirt and trees. It had become evidence. It had become a battleground. And now, with Judge Ramirez retreating to her chambers, the world waited for a verdict that would decide not only the fate of Coyote Pass, but the future of the Brown family itself. The gavel struck, its echo reverberating like a thunderclap through the courtroom. Silence fell instantly, the kind of silence so heavy it seemed to press down on the walls themselves. Every eye turned to the bench, waiting, breathless, as Judge Ramirez adjusted her glasses and began to speak. Her words were deliberate, precise, each syllable weighted with the gravity of justice. For those in attendance and for the millions watching the live feed across the world, it was not just a verdict being read, it was history unfolding in real time. The judge spoke with measured authority, acknowledging the tangled web of contributions, sacrifices, and broken promises that had brought the Brown family into her courtroom. She recognized the complexity of their dynamic, the informal agreements that had defined their lives, the blurred lines between marriage, business, and faith, and the decades of effort poured into Coyote Pass. Yet, despite that complexity, her voice carried an unmistakable clarity. Fairness could no longer be deferred. Equity must be honored. The courtroom leaned forward as if pulled by an invisible thread. This was not simply about land or property. It was about recognition, dignity, and justice for women whose sacrifices had too often been overshadowed by Kody Brown's vision of patriarchal control. And when Judge Ramirez declared that Mary and Janelle's investments, financial, emotional, and spiritual, were to be formally recognized and compensated, the air itself seemed to shift. This was a victory, a seismic shift in power. The plaintiffs, Mary and Janelle, had gained more than a legal triumph. They had gained validation. The years of being silenced, minimized, and sidelined had ended in a single ruling. For the Brown family, the verdict was a moment of reckoning, a turning point that fractured illusions and forced the truth into the open. As the court adjourned, the weight of the gavel's final strike still echoing, the Brown family stood to leave. Relief mixed with dread, triumph with apprehension. Cameras outside were already flashing. Reporters were shouting questions. On social media, hashtags were trending within minutes. The spectacle of sister wives had collided with the machinery of justice, and the fallout promised to be as explosive as the trial itself. Coyote Pass, once a symbol of unity and ambition, now carried the heavy burden of conflict and betrayal. Its hills, cabins, and trees had witnessed laughter, dreams, and whispered promises, but they had also borne silent witness to arguments, tears, and fractures that could no longer be ignored. Now, the land itself had become evidence, a central character in the courtroom drama, and a symbol of what was lost and what must be rebuilt. For Kody Brown, the verdict was a devastating blow. The patriarch who once envisioned himself as the architect of a sprawling family legacy was now confronted with the reality that his former wives had been recognized, officially, as equal contributors to the dream he had claimed as his own. The court had forced his hand. He and Robyn must compensate Mary and Janelle. What had once been his was no longer his alone. Mary and Janelle emerged from the courthouse like warriors carrying both scars and trophies. Mary, her voice quivering, as tears welled in her eyes, said simply to the cameras, "It's justice. That's all I can say." Janelle, more composed but equally powerful, declared, "We finally have a voice. We finally have recognition for all the work we put in." Their words, broadcast within seconds across news channels and social media, went viral. Across the world, women reposted, commented, and shared their triumph as a universal story of resilience and recognition. Meanwhile, Cody and Robyn were left in the shadow of defeat, their private conversations brimming with tension and blame. Financially, the ruling was devastating. Emotionally, it was worse. Robyn, who had long clung to the illusion of being the last wife standing, now had to face the public perception that she had benefited from Kody's favoritism at the expense of the other women. And Kody himself was forced into a humiliating reevaluation, not as patriarch, not as husband, but as a man stripped of control by the very women he had underestimated. The verdict spilled beyond the courthouse walls and into culture itself. Social media lit up with debates about fairness, polygamy, and women's rights. Fans of Mary and Janelle celebrated their courage, declaring this victory a cultural milestone. Supporters of Kody emphasized his years of dedication and financial risk, but their voices were drowned out by the louder chorus celebrating the women's triumph. In the weeks that followed, the aftermath was just as riveting as the verdict itself. The practical implementation of the ruling began: financial settlements, property division, and the looming sale of Coyote Pass. April 2025 marked the start of the process. Real estate agents arrived with cameras in tow, appraising the sprawling property now listed for $5 million. For the family, it was not merely a sale. It was the burial of a dream. Every cabin, every pine tree, every slope of the land had absorbed years of joy and pain, now to be handed to strangers for a price tag. Mary and Janelle saw the sale as bittersweet closure. No longer tethered to Kody's vision, the money they would gain offered them independence, opportunity, and new beginnings. For Kody and Robyn, however, the sale was a humiliating end. Kody's dream of uniting his wives under one roof had collapsed into a real estate listing, a reminder of ambition turned to ashes. The public followed every step with fascination. News outlets reported each development. Fans dissected the sale. Price speculated on the buyers and debated what the land truly symbolized. Some mourned the passing of a family dream, while others celebrated it as long overdue justice. In the end, Coyote Pass became something more than land. It became a story, a lesson, a cultural parable about ambition, betrayal, resilience, and justice. It proved that dreams built on control and inequality will eventually crumble, but dreams built on fairness and recognition can still rise from the ashes. For the Browns, the gavel strike was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by Kody's vision, but by the voices of those who had finally been heard. The sale of Coyote Pass was never just a signature on a contract. It was never only about money changing hands. For the Browns, it was the tearing down of a dream, brick by brick, until all that remained was the rubble of what could have been. This land had been painted as a paradise, the promised ground where unity would thrive, where children would play across acres of shared soil, and where 4 women and 1 man would finally prove that polygamy could work. But as the papers were signed and the last initials pressed into ink, that dream dissolved into silence, leaving behind the echoes of conflict, betrayal, and survival. When the judge declared the property sold, the courtroom fell into a hush. Outside, cameras clicked, reporters whispered, and fans waited for updates. But inside, for Mary and Janelle, it felt like oxygen had finally returned after years of suffocating intention. They looked at each other, not with words, but with the silent recognition of warriors who had finally won a battle too long in the making. For them, this was not about acreage. It was about dignity, about finally being recognized, not as shadows orbiting Kody Brown's ambition, but as rightful women with voices, power, and independence. The imagery of that final day clings to memory. The wind weaving through the pine trees, the cabin that had once stood as a beacon of unity, now abandoned and hollow, the Arizona hills stretching wide like silent witnesses to history. Coyote Pass had been a battlefield of legal disputes, broken promises, and whispered betrayals. And now, with the strike of a pen, it transformed into something else entirely. A symbol of resilience, compromise, and survival under the crushing weight of family ambition gone wrong. Mary, long overlooked and treated as an afterthought, suddenly stood tall in her victory. She took her share of the settlement and poured it into a home that was hers alone. Not Kody's, not the family's, hers. A place where her children could return without judgment, where her decisions mattered, and where every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall, reflected her soul rather than the compromises forced on her by years of polygamous chaos. For Mary, this wasn't just real estate. It was liberation carved into wood, paint, and earth. Janelle's journey ran parallel but with its own fire. Always the practical one, always the planner, she funneled her portion into building a future for her children. Educational funds, business ventures, and a foundation that belonged only to her. She had been Kody's second brain for decades, the accountant of dreams that never materialized, the organizer of ambitions that always collapsed under his ego. But now she wasn't financing his visions. She was financing her own legacy. For Janelle, this wasn't just closure. It was empowerment stamped into every check she wrote and every plan she made. And yet, the weight of years could not be erased so quickly. There were nights when Mary stared at her new home and wondered why it had taken decades to get here. There were mornings when Janelle fought the sting of remembering the family that never was, the unity that crumbled before it was ever built. Their independence came with scars, but those scars became proof of survival, proof that they had endured Kody's favoritism, Robyn's manipulation, and the endless circus of being sister wives under public scrutiny. Meanwhile, Kody and Robyn faced an entirely different story. The dreamers who had once envisioned Coyote Pass as a monument to their polygamous success were now the architects of its collapse. For Kody, losing the land was losing himself. That property had been his grand performance, his empire in the making. Without it, his title of patriarch felt hollow. For Robyn, the queen of loyalty and control, It meant living in a world no longer dominated by the shadow of shared dreams. She had fought for Kody, defended him, played his ally. But now she had to live in the silence that followed defeat. The world watched. TikTok clips dissected their downfall. Reddit threads analyzed every line of the court transcripts, and fans flooded social media with cheers for Mary and Janelle's independence. For years, the women had been framed as passive, submissive, trapped. Now they were seen as warriors who claimed justice. To the public, Coyote Pass wasn't just dirt and timber anymore. It was the graveyard of Kody's ego and the birthplace of Mary and Janelle's liberation. As weeks turned to months, the Browns adjusted. Mary filled her life with projects, friends, and peace. Janelle built her financial independence brick by brick. Kody wrestled with regret, identity, and the loss of control. Robyn navigated the ashes of her husband's shattered dream. And together, in fragmented silence, the family began to redefine itself, not by shared land, but by individual survival. Coyote Pass was gone, but in its absence, something new emerged. The Browns had learned, sometimes brutally, that dreams can shift, ambitions can falter, and families can fracture under the weight of ego. But they had also learned that from endings come beginnings, and from ashes can rise women stronger, wiser, and finally free. Finally free.